As the restorative justice movement has grown over the past 4 decades, many people think that it's primarily for young offenders and for very minor crimes. And frankly, the largest programs and the largest volumes of cases do focus in those areas. On the other hand, research and practice over the decades has clearly indicated restorative justice can be used with a full range of cases, including the most violent, serious cases imaginable: murder, multiple murder, attempted murder, sexual assault. In the early years of the movement, in the mid-1970s, none of us who were involved in those early years would have ever thought it would apply in those cases. I certainly didn't. And yet, we were quite surprised. Even in the early years, in the 1980s, I would be out giving presentations in different states about how this can be effective: restorative justice dialogue and victim offender mediation and burglary cases and minor assaults, giving a public presentation at a library, and someone would come up to me or they'd raise their hand and say, "Look, I think this sounds good for those cases, but what about me? My son was murdered, and from the moment my son was murdered, I have wanted to meet with the man who killed my son and ask him, why? Do you have any idea of the impact in my life, how it caused a dying within myself?" And that began to open our lives, and the number of others in the field, the few that were working and invited to work with serious cases, have similar stories. From the very beginning, in those early years to right at this moment, it's very important to point out that work in serious and very violent crimes, it's always been victim-initiated many years after the sentencing process, anywhere from a few years to 22 years, 25 years later. Hard for many people to believe. But it's not about programs or individuals like myself or others saying, "You should do this," or "This would be a good idea to promote your healing." No. It's about letting programs be known that this is a possible service, but not pushing it in any way, but allowing space for victims to come and seek out this kind of a process. In working in those serious and violent cases, the preparation process is far more intense. It can involve anywhere from 2 to 3 separate meetings with the victim, the offender, to 6 or 8 meetings. The time frame can be several months to several years. I recently completed a case where I worked with the parties, the prisoner and the young woman whose father was viciously murdered 22 years ago. I worked with them over a 2.5-year period before ever bringing them together. The preparation is supremely important, and allowing the time to flow in a way that's not dictated by your schedule as a mediator or facilitator, or certainly the system level. It has nothing to do with their schedule. But the schedule and the time flows on the basis of the person who is deeply harmed by the process and the event, the person who is victimized and traumatized. Because sometimes they want to meet with the offender right away, and they get close, but then they reach a point, well, they need to back off for a while. They go forward, they go back. So it's a matter of being very flexible and adapting it to their needs and always checking out with the prisoner. And I say prisoner because in those serious and violent cases, it's a rare situation where the person who created the harm, who caused the crime, committed it, is not in prison and for a very long time because of the nature of the crime committed. Facilitation that's used in working with severe and violent crime is very non-directive. It's a humanistic approach. It's very much the way many of us, if not most of us, do any kind of facilitation in restorative dialogue through its many different models and forms, where the facilitator is not talking a lot. They prepare the parties so they feel comfortable and safe, and they provide space for the parties to talk with each other, to have a healthy conversation in a good way. But the facilitator is very much in the background. Their presence is extremely important, their energetic presence. But their verbal presence is not as important as many of us as facilitators think. Another way of saying that, we've learned over the years that people in these situations oftentimes need us far less than our egos think they need us. They need us to be present, to hold that space, and to come in if they really need to. But they also need us to be more in the background, to give them space, to empower them to have the conversation. Let me share a case with you. A case that occurred quite a few years ago before there was any legal jurisdiction in the United States, in North America, or any part of the world that had any administrative law and protocol to allow this. This was a murder case that occurred in Rhode Island, where a woman's son was killed, murdered. She came to me 7 or 8 years after her son was killed, after she spent many years of anger, of organizing victims, of having public demonstrations to never let out her offender or other offenders that commit those crimes, ever let them out of prison. And she reached a point where she realized this was not helping with her own healing. And she was referred to me through someone I had trained in that state, in this whole field. And I spent about 16 months of preparation with her and the man who killed her son. Again, this had never been done in that state. There was no protocol. I had to negotiate individual agreements with the warden, the commissioner of corrections. It was very difficult to do that. When I brought them together, we met in the library in a prison. She had a support person with her, a therapist. The prisoner had a chaplain with him. I opened the session by saying a few words about our time together, about kind of how the gathering will flow, with first allowing them plenty of time to share their stories, to talk about the impact of what happened on their lives, beginning with Sue and all of the impact of having lost her son, and also with the man who killed her son, the impact on his life, what's happened since then. And they also, at a later point, were able to talk about ways of trying to repair the harm in whatever realistic ways, setting up a memorial fund in honor of her son. And at the end of the session, we had to adjourn abruptly because of the time frame in the prison, and Sue indicated, oh gosh, I think it was a year later, that she wanted a follow-up meeting, which I had indicated would be possible. And she wanted that meeting with this man because she wanted to let him know that she's moving on in her life. She's no longer obsessed with the horror and the trauma of what occurred when her son was killed. She was accepting a whole different job in a different state, and she wanted to let the man who killed her son know. And when I brought them together a year and a half later in the prison, after additional dialogue and sharing of stories and talking about the impact on their life, again, the session ended with Sue reaching out across the table and offering forgiveness to this man. Not forgiveness in a direct, verbal way, but in a way that was clear. It was kind of thanking him for allowing them to have come together. And the man who committed this act, Alfred, actually put his hand on Sue's, and Sue put her hand, other hand, on Alfred's, and they were actually holding each other in thanks. And again, this was not a big, articulate, intellectual discussion about forgiveness. No way. It was a very beautiful, sacred moment where they were touching the humanity of each other. It was a beautiful thing to witness. Well, let me tell you about a case that occurred after this began coming out. And today, there's 27 states in America that have formal protocol to allow a victim of the worst kind of crime imaginable. They have the right to meet the person in prison who committed this, if that person is willing, because it is absolutely voluntary for both. This is a case that was referred to me 20 years after her father was viciously killed in upstate Minnesota. Anne contacted me through an email message, of all things. She had found out about my work in our center, the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking, on the internet, She was fascinated by reading about us and some of the stories and work we've done. She sent me a long email. I called her back, and from the moment of that first call, I sensed from the energy of her voice, her tone, that this was a strong woman, and she was on a real yearning for a journey of healing. And in a deeper sense, a journey that spoke to her own spirituality. I met over about a 12 to 13-month period with her multiple times, and the man in prison who committed this, Robert. And when I brought them together, it was a 5-hour session with breaks. And during that 5-hour session, myself and the person who I was training in as a co-facilitator, we spoke together no more than 10 minutes, if even that. We know because it was time-coded, because it was videoed at their request. And we essentially opened the meeting, gently opened the meeting, because they already knew us. We had talked with them quite a lot. We opened the meeting, allowed them time and space to settle in. We turned to Anne, I did, and said, Anne, I know this has been a tough journey. Can you tell Robert the impact it's really had on your life? And she looked at Robert, not at me. And the story flowed out, and the tears flowed. And Robert was locked eye contact with her, and he teared up. And when she was through telling her story, after quite a long time, then we invited Robert to tell Anne the impact it's had on his life. And he opened up in a very real and genuine way. And myself and the other co-facilitator I was training in, again, we were not directing things. We would have gentle questions or just gentle guides, shifting kind of the energy of the conversation. This went on, again, for 5 hours. And after 5 hours, an incredible thing occurred. And let me point out something. During all of the preparation work with Anne, she never talked about forgiveness. I never added in that word or talked about how there's good research to show that forgiveness can be healing and good for your physical health as well as mental and spiritual health. Never talked about that. If she wanted to talk about that, I would have gladly done that. I teach courses on that. But I don't bring up the forgiveness word unless it comes from the person directly involved. So getting back into the actual dialogue, after 5 hours, there was this pause. And I could see Anne, I knew something was going on in her mind and her heart. And there was this silence, and we just let it be. And she turned and looked at Robert and said, Robert, I want you to know I forgive you. I refuse to carry this with me any longer. It's affected my life with my husband, with my kids. I'm letting go of this. And I hope you can forgive my father for what he's done to your family because of the affair and all of the conflict that came out of that and led to you killing my father. And at that moment, Robert was not only tearing, he was sobbing. And he didn't ask for forgiveness. He received it in the most genuine way imaginable. And the session ended, oh gosh, around 5.5 hours later. And in follow-up interviews with both, it's been very clear that them coming together had a very significant impact on shifting the whole movement of their lives, of depowering the trauma that occurred, of giving them a greater sense of moving on in their lives. Not closure. You never get closure in these kind of serious and violent cases. But you can get a greater sense of closure, a sense, not total closure, a greater sense of being able to let go and move on in life and find some peace. A final case I'd like to highlight is a recent one I did with a woman by the name of Pam. Pam was referred to me, I think it was 22 years after her father was viciously killed in St. Paul, Minnesota. She was one of the angriest victim survivors, family members of those killed that I'd ever dealt with as a practitioner. She just oozed out understandable anger. Her husband did. Earlier years in my career, I probably would have been scared away by the anger, but I've long since learned to work with the anger, that the seeds of healing and growth are found in honest, open expression of anger that can be channeled in a healthy way. This is the case where I spent over 2.5 years with Pam and going into prison, meeting with the man who killed her father. And when I was finally able to bring them together in prison, a remarkable thing happened. Again, never in all of that preparation did she ever talk about forgiveness or wanting to forgive him. Never did I bring up the word forgiveness and say, oh, you really should forgive. It'll help your healing process. It'll give you greater emotional and spiritual and physical strength. And I could quote studies that have found that. I never said that. This is part of the paradox of forgiveness. But when I brought them together, this turned out to be far more emotional than I would have anticipated because of all the anger coming together. Pam was able to tell her story, the impact on her life, the devastation of having her father killed, and in such a brutal way. She had so many questions of Jim, the man who committed this. And then Jim was able to talk about what led up to this. Why did he do this? The impact on his life, living in prison, what's this been like? Then they had lots of questions about the impact, about their stories. And then they talked about their futures and about Jim's hope to eventually be released from prison and to move on in a whole new direction in his life. He did not have a strong criminal background apart from this specific violent act. He had some smaller crimes, but nothing like this, like a murder. And his plans for the future of getting a job and moving on, Pam's concern with her life, her concern for Jim that he never commit anything like this. And never during that time did Pam ever express forgiveness. Yet it was one of my deepest teachings about the energy of forgiveness that I've borne witness to over the years in many of these serious and violent cases. A shifting of energy, moving from this sense of anxiety and understandable anger to a sense of peace and release, even when the words are never used. Frankly, if the word forgiveness was used, it probably would have cheapened the process, both for Pam and in the earlier case I shared with you. In subsequent interviews with Pam, and when I've had her speak in some of my classes, she almost chokes over the word forgiveness because she has all of these illusions and learnings of what you should forgive and what she was taught in church and what her culture says. And yet she'll also talk about how she can't really forgive as she understands forgiving, but something happened. There's like this moment of grace she talks about. She came to recognizing Jim is not some animal, some monster. He's a human being, a very wounded human being. And she feels far more at peace with her life. Today, there are many cases like the ones I've shared with you. In the earlier years, there were just a handful of anecdotal stories. In fact, in those early years, I actually thought it was only a rare group of family survivors of homicide that would ever want to meet with a person who killed their loved one, or other victims of violence, sexual assault or attempted homicide. I really thought this was only probably appropriate for the small percent of people. We have learned through research I've conducted and through practice of so many people at this point in the history of our movement, we've learned there are far more people than we would ever think. Not the majority, but far more people. In fact, the first terrorist act in our country by Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma, the city bombing, one of the victim organizers of all the families contacted me. There were about 17 victims, family survivors, of those killed by Timothy McVeigh's terroristic act, blowing up the building in Oklahoma. 17 that wanted to meet with McVeigh to learn, why did he do this? To tell him the human reality of their loved ones that were killed. And I actually tried to work with them on that and contacted the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, but I couldn't get into that because the case was so politicized. I was never able to go down to Terre Haute Prison in Indiana to meet Timothy McVeigh. But I share this with you as just one indicator of how this is not just a small handful of people. In fact, when Texas began the first publicly sanctioned with administrative law program in America, actually anywhere in the world, it was around 1993, I believe, and it's still operating. When they opened up the program, they had a waiting list of hundreds of family survivors of those who were killed that wanted to meet the man or woman in prison, not to cause physical harm to them, even though many of them would have done that at the time and told me so in my research interviews. But for their own healing, they wanted to meet the man in prison or the woman in prison who killed their loved one. All of which is to say, it's not just a handful of people who are predisposed to forgiveness and healing or reconciliation that choose the path of wanting to enter restorative dialogue through victim-offender mediation and dialogue or conferencing with violent offenders who have killed their loved ones. No. There are far more people than we could ever imagine. I predict in the coming years we'll see even more examples of this.